Welcome to another episode of the Meal Prep Monday podcast. I'm your host and founder of Prep Dish, Allison Schaaf. In today's episode, I'm talking about heat. I'm wrapping up our 4-part series on salt, fat, acid, heat, and specifically going to go through 3 things to keep in mind in cooking with heat. Before I get into today's episode, I have an email from Prep Dish subscriber Stephanie. Stephanie writes, Prep Dish has been essential for cooking for my family. It takes the thought out of the recipes and gives me the comfort knowing that whatever recipe I choose, it's going to be healthy and delicious, but isn't as expensive or as unhealthy as a meal delivery service. Would highly recommend for anyone who needs help planning and doesn't want to use a meal delivery service. Stephanie, thank you so much for sharing. I'm glad that it's allowed you to help choose, healthy recipes and have meals that your whole family can enjoy. If you're listening to this and you have not tried Prep Dish, we do have a 2-week free trial set up at prepdish.com/MPM. Again, that's prepdish.com/MPM, short for Meal Prep Monday. Okay, let's go ahead and dive into our 4th part here, talking about heat. Again, this is based on the book Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. If you have not checked out the book, I highly recommend it. Like I've mentioned in the past episodes, it really is one, if you're interested in food and cooking. It has more of a narrative too. Like I found it interesting to just sit down and read it. I was doing it for continuing education to keep up with my, dietitian credentials, but I really did enjoy reading through this book. And the final section is heat. This is kind of what makes cooking. And heat also, unlike the others, salt, fat, even some usually acid, you can't really see it working, but this it's something that you can actually see in real time, happening and working and cooking your food, right? Okay, so I'm going to go through 3 different considerations with heat. First is the type, so dry versus moist heat. The second is high versus low heat, and things to keep in mind there. And then the third one is to keep in mind that heat moves and you need to kind of use it wisely. Okay, so first of all, figuring out dry versus moist heat. So dry heat is when you want intensity, you want flavor, you want crispness, you want maybe charred, any of those sort of things. If you want this caramelization or browning, you're going to need to use a dry heat. So this would include things like roasting, grilling, sauteing, frying, broiling. So for example, roasting vegetables at a high heat for crispy edges, or grilling your steak for that, like I said, that char, getting salmon under the broiler and kind of getting that little golden crust. So all of these are examples of dry heat. And these items that I listed, that doesn't mean you can only use them for dry heat. They can definitely be used for moist heat, but it's going to have a different result, right? So moist heat, you're usually looking for kind of a tenderness. I think of it almost as more of a, with the dry heat, it was intensity of flavor. I think of more of a richness of flavor. I also think a lot of times of heavier roasts and meats that you're putting in a crock pot all day. So it's kind of working with that fat to develop flavor. And it's a more gentle cooking method. So it's good for delicate foods, but then also, so it's kind of like both ends of the spectrum, the delicate foods that you don't want to, harm, an egg, poaching an egg, but then also for the really tough foods. So think again, those roasts and stuff. So you can use this to break down the tougher cuts of meat. So techniques included in this would be boiling, steaming, poaching, and braising. Braising being one that I really, really like. Okay, so poaching for eggs just creates this nice, soft, silky texture. You're not letting the water boil. You're just kind of keeping, again, this gentle method. Cooking beans or lentils to soften them, but not doing a really hard, aggressive boil so they're breaking apart at the seams. Braising tough cuts of meat. So again, those roasts, but also ribs. I love, slow cooking ribs all day to where they're just falling apart. Again, very different than a grilled steak in terms of texture and flavor, but it's nice to have both, right? And then steaming vegetables. So, something like asparagus and getting these more fresh, bright flavors and keeping it delicate versus being overpowered by a grill or a roast. And then number 2, going through high heat versus low heat. It's similar. The high heat is the browning, the crisping, and the intense flavors. So, stir frying vegetables, roasting potatoes, broiling something, at the end to get like the crispness on it. And then low heat is tenderizing and slow flavor development. So, scrambled eggs, simmering a tomato sauce, a soup that you kind of do on low for a good part of the day, or a chili or something, even a broth. And then the third thing to keep in mind is that you really need to work with the heat and realize, like, even when you remove it, it's going to continue to cook, right? So heat moves, I think she said at one point. And so just knowing that, like, even if you remove something from the pan, it's going to continue to cook. So this is something, even in baking, like cookies or brownies, like you might want to take them out a minute or two before they're done, especially if you're grilling something. We always bring in the steaks and then put them to, that's why it always says, rest for a few minutes, because it'll kind of have that cooking that will continue to happen. With meats, you can usually leave them 5, even 10 degrees lower than the temperature you want, because it will kind of have that cooking that continues on after you remove it from the heat source. So hopefully this just helps you to think through the different types of heat, which ones you're using, maybe not using, and thinking through, like, experimenting a little bit. I have my go-tos that I like, I love roasted broccoli, but I found my kids actually really like boiled or steamed broccoli. So we'll mix it up, right? And I think especially with kids, or, you're cooking for your family, it's interesting to play around with different types of heat and cooking methods just to see. And I've mentioned this on the picky eating episodes that I've done, but a lot of times with my personal chef clients, I would always ask, what foods do you like or not like? And, if there's anything you don't want to see on your menu, we can leave it off. But a lot of times they'd say something like Brussels sprouts. And I'm like, well, yeah, maybe you don't like them boiled and falling apart like you had growing up. But a lot of times I find people don't like the way something's prepared, but that doesn't mean they don't like that food item. So playing around with heat is a good way to mix it up and find different ways that you can enjoy, an asparagus or a salmon or whatever it is. It's just a fun way to, one, hit on something that your whole family enjoys, keep some variety up of, like, having these healthy foods, but in a variety of ways. It can keep life interesting, your meals interesting. So I just think it's a fun thing to play around with. And yeah, maybe you do find one and you're like, okay, like for me, like I love roasted sweet potatoes and I like the crispiness. Sometimes we will do like a slower cooked baked sweet potato, but we know what we like, and then you kind of land on it and you can develop your go-tos over time. But I would encourage you this week to kind of think through some of the different cooking methods and heat sources you're using for proteins, vegetables, all the different things. And, is there a way to mix it up and play around with it? So hopefully this episode inspires you to think through that and try out a few different things in the kitchen. Speaking of which, if you have not tried our meal plans, that's a great way to try out just different methods. And we also try and include varieties and not always doing the same thing, and, switching back and forth between different methods and helping you to keep your taste buds happy. So if you would like to try our plans, that's at prepdish.com/MPM. And I know I say this every week, but it's 14 days free. So if you haven't tried them, it's just the best way to give it a chance and see how it works for you and your family. Okay, that's all I have for this week. Next week, I believe next week we're coming back with a few interviews. I don't know if I'm going to do every month like I did last year. Last year, I basically did one interview a month. I'm not sure on the cadence this year, but I'm going to be including some interviews, and we have one coming up next week that I think you're really going to like. I'm excited for it. So I will be back again next Monday with that interview episode.